Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Group 15's presentation of the Emancipation Proclamation. While the original start of the war was not about slavery, equality, or freedom, the original start of the war was about reuniting the nation. Although issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was something that was in line with Lincoln's moral values, as well as the abolitionists and radical Republicans that met with Lincoln shortly after the war started, Lincoln was hesitant about issuing an anti-slavery decree so soon after the start of the war because he needed support from the Northern Democrats as well as the neutral border states. So that led Lincoln to running a war campaign that was more focused on reuniting the nation rather than on slavery. Lincoln also believed that as President of the United States of America, that his ultimate goal and duty was to preserve the Union and the nation at any cost. So much so that when he issued the proclamation, he would have allowed the southern states to return as slaveholding states just to keep the nation unified. In other words, if the southern states had returned to the nation within the 100-day grace period of the proclamation, they would have allowed to keep the slaves that they had. While the border states would have had to have gotten rid of their states, southern states would have been allowed to keep their slaves. And Lincoln was so into trying to justify that the war was not about race, he would turn down the African American the African Americans that would come and trying to enlist in the army because they wanted to fight against the slavery of the South. Lincoln didn't want them in there because that would be used as a justification for the South and the Northerners that didn't support the war, that it was about race and equality, and that's something, at least in the North, they didn't want to get behind. And for the South, it was a threat to their everyday way of life. So as the war went on, moods did change about what was considered fair and equal, at least in the way of African Americans, and that led to division amongst the Union generals. So while some of them still had traditional views of belief of African Americans in slavery and would return any captured slaves they had on the battlefield back to their original owners, while others, such as Benjamin Butler, would keep their caught slaves as contraband and hire them into the army and pay them to do the housekeeping work, so laundry, dishes, things like that for the war. So and the African Americans that were caught with people such as Benjamin Butler were happy to do so because they were allowed to join the army, and they saw it, even though they were doing housekeeping work, they saw it as a way to help aid the fight against the South and their slavery. And this division amongst the generals caused some issues for Lincoln because he wasn't running a unified army, trying to fight to reunite a nation, so that balance wasn't working out. And so in 1861, Lincoln decided Congress and representatives passed the Compensation Act, which was a way to keep the North unified, and its main goal was a prototype to the Emancipation Proclamation. The Compensation Act will be talked about later, but basically it's unifying all the generals under an idea such as Benjamin Butler, to where any captured slaves were treated as contraband, and you could hire them to do the housekeeping work of your armies. So when it came to officially enacting the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a few steps and forerunners to it. And as mentioned earlier, Benjamin Butler, with his original ideas of treating slaves as contraband, and the Compensation Act, which ran as the official prototype to the proclamation. If the Compensation Act would have gotten a different reaction from the nation, such as backlash and hate, then it would have changed how the proclamation was written and could have caused it to not even be written in the first place. And while enacting both the act and the proclamation, Lincoln faced risk. of course, like anything. But those two acts and proclamations in particular have the face of running and being called unconstitutional, because it's written in the Constitution that people have a right to own their slaves, while the act and the proclamation were both going against slavery. And he faced the risk the public, and if the public didn't call the act unconstitutional, he still ran the risk of them flat out denying and rejecting these, and that would have changed the whole plan for the proclamation as well as the course of the war. And the set stage for Lincoln's War was important because, or not the set stage for Lincoln's War, but rather the set stage for Lincoln issuing the proclamation was an important scene because it followed the Battle of Antietam, which was the single bloodiest day in the Civil War. And issuing the proclamation right after that on the 22nd of September in 1863 was a way for Lincoln to show that this war, the meanings has changed and we need to end this war. It was a way for Lincoln to use it as justification that, see, this is no longer about reuniting the nation and more of trying to free a people that have been oppressed. So that stage of the battle was important for Lincoln and as a way of justifying his proclamation. And yet another one where the Battle of Antietam was justifying the Emancipation Proclamation. The outlook on another important speech that Lincoln, this one was a law, but it was a speech that Lincoln gave, was very important. That's the Gettysburg Address. It was a short address. It was less than 300 words, and it was given in November of 1863 as a way to remember the lives lost during the battles of Gettysburg. Lincoln wasn't the main speaker of this event. He was thrown in more of as a halfway thought, and his speech lasted less than 3 minutes. But it was still significant to the point of the war. Instead of drawing influence from the Constitution, which many speakers at the time had done, Lincoln drew his influence from the Declaration of Independence, quoting the line, "All men are created equal," because that by going to the Declaration of Independence, he's going to the very core original foundation of this country, rather than something that's more of a do this, do that list, or you can do this and you can't do that list of the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is one of freedom, one of hope, one of equality, all of which those were the core fighting, with the core what the Civil War was about. And so by quoting the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln is more able to change the public's perspective on what the war was about. And the proclamation and primarily the Gettysburg Address were both a plea for equality, as said, and as a plea to end the war, to say, look how many lives have been lost. These lives are your family, your friends, your neighbors, people you care about. We're all one nation fighting each other, and that needs to end. So the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address were both a plea for the war to end, and were both a big part in changing the whole course of the war from a fight of unification to a fight of equality and of freedom.